Jim, it's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you after listening to you for, oh gosh, well over 20 years. I suppose we better get the conversation underway with the World Cup, because the World Cup is pretty much upon us. Are you looking forward to the World Cup?
I am. I'm particularly looking forward to seeing the variety of teams, Afghanistan especially in the fold, and an Australian team that seems to be developing some confidence and some harmony after some distractions and disappointments over the last 12 months. I mean, there's no doubt the form of the team has improved remarkably without its two stalwart star players, Smith and Warner. So with those men back, you'd think Australia is going to be a chance to at least get to the semi-finals. But England is certainly playing some good cricket, and India are around it, and a few other teams. I think New Zealand might go pretty well. Pakistan's a bit enigmatic. You don't know what they're going to do. And South Africa, I'd worry about them going through to the last four without a player of de Villiers' clout. But there's all sorts of things that can happen with the weather conditions. Maybe a few varying pitches, although at the moment, in the lead-up of the practice matches, they all look like batsmen's paradises to me. Good flat pitches, fast grounds, short boundaries. But the ICC will now be managing the preparation of pitches, so maybe that'll change.
Why do you think the pitches in England have changed so much? I mean, we always loved a contest, didn't we? Back in the 90s, the mid 90s and 80s and 70s and so on, a good contest between bat and ball. But that really seems to be the case. Do you think it's the advent of T20 cricket and so much of it that has forced the change of the pitches?
I think there's also added to that been a change in the way the squares, the pitches are prepared because of the soil they're now using, whereas the soil was unique to a ground. Now it seems that the same soil is going around, as it were. And although we're seeing pretty good pitches for batting in these T20 and one-day games, the fact remains that when test matches are played, most of the grounds still seem to be able to come up with a surface that keeps the bowlers interested. It might have a bit to do with the quality of the bowling too, and the fact that they're using a Duke's ball. Certainly this series for the Ashes, they're using one with a prominent seam, and so the ball's bound to do a bit in the right conditions. But I think it's something that they need to look at. But the other side of that is the chief executive has influenced most of these grounds, if not the overall influence of the ECB, and the feeling that between the relationship of television to cricket and the chief executives and the rest of it, that they want pitches that are going to give you 100 overs in one day, and they're quite happy to see 350 beat 349. It seems to have got to a point where that is the way the fans enjoy the spectacle. That might be dictated to by television stations, but it's more and more the case, I think, that all the matches we watch are batting exhibitions, can I say.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. Now, I want to talk a bit about you, Jim. I mean, as I've alluded to at the beginning of the interview, I've been listening to you whenever I can, when you're on ABC radio, and you've brought a great deal of joy and pleasure and knowledge to me personally. You've been around for a long time. Where did radio commentary in particular, when and where did it all start for you?
Well, for me, I was fortunate enough at the third attempt to get a traineeship in the ABC when I was 22. I'd, in fact, had a crack at it when I was at school. And the fellow I knew at school who was older than me and had been to university, was a very good all-round sportsman called Peter Mears. He got the job the first time. The second time, I think it might have been Gordon Bray. And then I went to uni, and after that worked in insurance. And at the third attempt, I got a break and had to do an audition at the SCG at a test match, sitting up in the back of the stand with a tape recorder. And I think that audition won the day. So I heard later on. So there I was, age 22 in 1973, getting the chance to join some great voices and personalities in the history of Australian broadcasting, and in an era which was so rich with diversity and quality, because at that point the ABC covered everything on radio and television, whereas today almost all the sport that's covered by the national broadcaster is on radio. We hardly do anything on TV. The forces of nature, of commerce, have pushed most major sport onto the commercials and pay-per-view, and the ABC is very much on the margins there, although they probably should be having a bit more of a go if they were to fulfil the obligations of their charter as the national broadcaster. But that's a discussion to have with someone else, I suppose. But no, they were wonderful, formative years with brilliant broadcasters like McGilvray. Norman May was the quintessential all-round broadcaster, and all the other young fellas that I've grown up with, like Gordon Bray, and Peter Mears was there at the time, the late Drew Morfitt. There were a host of us who were lucky enough to have the chance to do what we loved on the radio, and that sort of passion has kept me going, I suppose, to a point where when friends say to me, "Do you describe what you do as a broadcaster as work?" I said, I've never sworn once in my life about what I do. It's a four-letter word that I don't use because I'm lucky enough to do something that I really enjoy.
I'm sure I've actually heard you doing a little bit of television work. If I remember correctly, it would have been when Sri Lanka toured Australia up in the winter, when you used to play the occasional test match up in the winter. And if my memory serves me correctly, you did a bit of work there. I remember listening to you. But you adapted very well between radio and television. But which do you prefer? Do you prefer radio or TV?
Oh, no, radio is the number one medium for someone who likes to use the language. And cricket gives you more of an opportunity to do that and to talk around the game than doing. I used to do rugby union, rugby league. I even did soccer, football at one stage. But the moment passes so often in those high impact, fast moving sports. At least in cricket, you get a chance to dwell on what's occurring or go somewhere else, because you do have the time factor. Bowlers wandering back to the top of their runs and drinks breaks and all the other things that go on now in the game to disrupt the flow of it on occasions. So cricket's the vehicle and radio's the medium. TV tends to it tends to stop you doing what you want to do, because you're always reacting to what the producer is saying you should be concentrating on, or they were putting something up on the screen. I actually worked on TV in the last South Africa Australia series in South Africa,
right,
on the SABC.
Oh, right.
And I hadn't done it for years. I found it a lot of fun working on television, but radio is a more nourishing medium for a broadcaster.
You said that you got the job as commentator in 1973, so I would imagine you've been lucky enough to commentate in all the World Cups, 75, 79, right up to the last one in 2015. Would that be correct?
No, well, the first two, Alan McGilvray was very much the main man at the ABC, and he worked on those two, 75, 79. But they sent me off to England in 83, and I did that, and Australia was appalling in that series, which was well won by India. But Australia was still having a hangover from World Series cricket, and various personality clashes that were going on within the team. They didn't do justice to themselves. And then, of course, by 1987, there'd been a rebuild with Alan Border and Bob Simpson in charge. But as sometimes happens with the ABC, they've decided not to send anyone over to India in 87, even though one broadcaster had reminded the manager that, it may look a weak side, but they could even win that tournament. And so they did. Then 1992 in Australia, I was part of that. 96 with Sri Lanka winning, I was over there on the subcontinent. 99, a colleague of mine at the time, Tim Lane,
yes.
did the World Cup.
Yes.
Then I was in South Africa in 2003, West Indies 2007, 2011. Glenn Mitchell, who was then at the ABC, covered that tour on the subcontinent. And, of course, 2015 in Australia, I was around it. So, I've seen a few, but not all of them.
But when you watch so many World Cups and indeed Ashes series, does the novelty eventually wear off, or do you still have the same thrill and excitement going to an Ashes or a World Cup as you would have done when you went for your very first stint as a commentator?
I don't think the novelty is worn off. Maybe the style of cricket can get to you a bit, particularly with the T20 that's been pushed around at the moment as the main event in world cricket by a lot of people. Not that I don't dislike T20, but if you want to have a menu degustation, and I don't mind a good dinner either, well, you go to a test match.
Absolutely.
That's where you can get a lot more variety. It's a lot more wholesome an experience played over 4 or 5 days, where there can be so many changes. And some of those changes take hours to effect, others take 1 or 2 balls. So it's not as if it's a script that you're referring to. It keeps changing. And essentially, as a broadcaster, you're storytelling and you're doing it with a group of people who are normally very knowledgeable and sometimes extremely amusing, whimsical about the game. And that's the other side of it, I suppose, getting to meet so many different people and being in their company at the ground and afterwards over a few cordials to talk about the game and everything else that's going around. So there's a certain pleasure to being around a test series and the people that you are working with and describing what is an enchanting game.
Is there any particular test series that really stands out? I mean, you would have seen so many from 1973 up to the present. I would imagine the test matches of the 70s, and 80s would really stand out. But I guess when Shane Warne started getting involved and Glenn McGrath, 2 real match winners, there'd be some memorable matches there that you would easily talk about.
Well, the game keeps improving. McGilvray said years ago when asked what's the difference between the game you are doing commentary on towards the end of your career, Alan, and when you played and started doing this before the war. And he said, there's no doubt, the athleticism of the players. And this is before cricket in Australia became as well paid as it is now. It was marginally professional back there in the 70s. Yeah. Before Packer and the changes came along. Not that he affected a massive change in terms of pay. It was minor compared to the 1995 Memorandum of Understanding, which unleashed vast sums on contract for players that weren't realised before. So there's that change, and I suppose with that change to professionalism, it comes to a few other aspects, which includes the better preparation of players. In terms of a exhibition of skill, a contest that was unpredictable, the series in India in 2001 would have to be the one that comes to mind. It started with the death of Bradman on the eve of the test in Mumbai, and then an extraordinary 3-day test with centuries to Gilchrist and Hayden, with the ball turning all over the place and Australia winning by a mile inside 3 days. And then when India followed on at Eden Gardens in the next game, it looked like it was all over. And of course, we know what happened next with Laxman and Dravid batting extraordinarily, to the point that Australia not only missed the chance of winning, they got thumped in the fourth innings. It made the series 1-1 and set it up beautifully for Chennai. And we had a wonderful game of cricket there, which was right on the edge, and eventually sneaked out by India on a 2-wicket win. So I think that in terms of an amazing series, is one of the best. There are others, the 2005 Ashes, which turned on its head when Glenn McGrath trod on a ball before the game in Edgbaston, and that changed the whole course of the series, with England winning that game. Fantastic game of cricket, despite Shane Warne's influence by 2 runs. And then the other great series would be 1999 in the West Indies, when the West Indies were humiliated in the first test. And on the back of Lara came back to win the next 2, which meant Australia had to win the 4th test to level the series. And they did that by dropping Shane Warne in part.
Yes, indeed.
Which is something he's never forgotten. So those 3 series would stand out, but I've missed a few on the way around the discussion.
Absolutely. No, that's understandable. But and then I guess the low point was the whole Steve Smith, David Warner, Cameron Bancroft debacle. And I actually remember listening to you on radio and you becoming incredibly emotional, and understandably so. I mean, had it been me talking about Zimbabweans doing that, I would have been exactly the same as you. But how difficult was that for you as a proud Australian to have to be, and also a journalist, to be able to talk about that, and maintain some form of dignity, which you did so well? I mean, yes, you were emotional, but you still kept such a level head and showed, brought all your maturity to the commentary box, so to speak. That must have been very, very difficult for you.
It was at the time, yes, and became pretty emotional because of the disrespect the players had shown for the game. And unfortunately, as we've observed on the analysis of it all, it's brought about by the lack of experience of life to a large extent. I talk about the players living in a bubble, and I think it goes back to what a famous rugby league coach said about his team here years ago, Jack Gibson. And he said, no one's playing football for this club unless they've got a job. That wouldn't work today, obviously.
For sure.
But he wanted his players to be part of the wider world that was looking after them, that they were involved in on a periphery as footballers. He wanted them to be realistic. And unfortunately, with it was a lack of leadership from Smith and the coach Darren Lehman over this one, because it had been festering for some time. And the administrators had too much of an eye on the prize and not enough on the conduct of the game and of their players. So I sensed that something silly was going to occur that would bring the game into disrepute, and I'd written to James Sutherland, the chief executive, after that nonsense in Durban with Warner and the cop having a contretemps in the stairwell, and pointing out that you need to get hold of those that are running the show and make sure this doesn't continue to fester to the point where who could anticipate? But clearly that ball tampering thing has been around with a lot of teams. But there's a brazenness to what was done in desperation for the result the Cricket Australia was all over, winning at all cost mentality and the rest of it. And what followed turned the game upside down in many ways, apart from turfing out 3 players on suspension. There was an upheaval in the administration because they decided to have a review. And as any business would know, if you're going to have a review, make sure you know the answers before you start. There's a bit of a political lesson in there as well, I think.
Yeah.
So what's come out of that is settling down now, but there's still some unease, but particularly amongst those of us who have been rusted on cricket fans about the way the Australian team conducts itself. I think they've done pretty well under Tim Payne. He's been the most extraordinary accidental Australian captain I can recall. No one would ever have considered him as a captain of the Australian team. They might have even thought of him as a wicketkeeper after he had that injury, but he's done a fantastic job with the side, as has Aaron Finch and Justin Langer to an extent. Now, how that plays out with all these players together for 3 months in England, and there's clearly still some disenchantment, shall we say, with David Warner in particular. So we'll see how it plays out. If they're playing well, no one will comment much on the rumblings that are around the dressing room with the various personalities and such. But if they're losing, I'm sure the media will pull it apart.
Yeah, you would pretty much think so. Jim, a cricket journalist, one to another, we could sit here talking all day, and I'm very sure you don't have all day. We could, absolutely. And it's been a pleasure, but I just, in conclusion, want to talk to you about a horrific situation that happened to you, experience that happened to you back in the Olympics, when you were covering the Olympics on television, because you're such an all-rounder that's exactly what you do. It's not just, as you said, cricket that you cover, but you suffered a stroke, and yet a couple of years later, here you are still commentating and talking about the game with as much enthusiasm and passion as you would have done back in 1973. The recovery, we've all watched from afar and admired from afar. But just talk us through what happened that fateful night.
Well, we were doing most of the coverage out of the studios in Sydney to save costs, radio and TV, rather than sending over a phalanx of commentators. Sent some, but most of it was done at this end. And I was on early in the morning. I was actually introducing a yachting segment. A fellow called Tom Burton was about to win a gold medal for Australia. Right. And I had an old colleague of mine, Peter Shipway, in the studio to talk about this. Now, as it turned out, it was either no wind or too much wind, and they didn't race. So we were there to have a chat. And I started speaking at one point, and I just lost it. Something flicked through my brain like electric shock, whatever it was. And I was gibbering. So I just quietly stepped to one side and, being professionals, as they are, the other guys took over. And as I sort of quietly sat down, then lay down, one of my broadcasting colleagues, Tim Gable, said, "Jim's just had a stroke." He's not a doctor, but he was right. So that was the start of an unfortunate situation that took me away from the game. But luckily, although I have some sort of restrictions on the use of my right arm and right leg, I've got back to a position where I'm mobile and I can do things and I can get around. And if it hadn't have been for quick attention from the paramedics and the good work of my wife and the lovely the Angels of Mercy at St Vincent's Rehab, I'd probably be in a lot worse position. So that's the way to look at it. It could have been worse, and here I am. spruiking away to you and to everyone else when I get the opportunity. So I've been very lucky.
I used the word fateful, which was a wrong word to use, but I'm sure you know what I was getting at. I mean, it's just amazing the way that you've bounced back, and you've just carried on. Exactly, it's a massive inspiration, I think, to people in general, let alone journalists. It's wonderful to hear that. So, Jim, thank you very much. It's been an absolute joy and pleasure talking to you. Are you going to be involved in this World Cup, the upcoming World Cup? You're going to England?
I will be there for game 5 played by Australia until the end of the World Cup, and then I'm staying on for the Ashes. So I'll be in England for about 3 months. Yes.
I tell you what, I would love to be part of the Ashes or to be witnessing the Ashes any day, because you were talking about dinner. Test cricket to me is your combination of meat, gravy, potatoes, a good dry red wine, and a little bit of dessert, as opposed to the great amount of bubblegum cricket that we watch these days, especially with T20 cricket. I'm sure you concur with that, at least to a certain extent.
I do, but the other side of it is to remember, looking at the positive side.
Yes.
Cricket is fortunate to have these various moods and interpretations of the game. Not many sports have that, and they all gel together to make it what it is. And if the game is ever going to, become a sport of interest in China and places that are far flung and away from the Commonwealth of Nations, then it needs T20, T10, whatever it is, to at least introduce everyone to the enchantment of cricket.
Well, again, Jim, thank you very much for your time. And I'm sure I speak on every single cricket fan when I say that we hope you're still around for many more years, and we wish you nothing but the very best.
Thank you, Dean. Lovely to talk to you. And you keep trucking along and showing that it doesn't matter what particular disability you may have, you can still contribute as you're doing to the game.
Thank you, Jim.